Hello, my name is Ashley Linares Garcia, and today I'll be presenting my final research project on culturally sustaining pedagogy in Latinx education for Sociology 3AC. This presentation explores how CSP responds to a long history of assimilation in U.S. education and how it helps reshape Latinx students' experiences within broader social structures, which are the organized patterns and institutions that really shape people's lives, like schools, policies, and funding systems. My project uses the sociological imagination, the tool that helps us connect personal experiences to larger institutional forces to really understand how Latinx students navigate school environments that often devalue their cultural and linguistic strengths. I also wanted to draw on micro, meso, and macro level analysis. Micro level looking at individual interactions like classroom relationships, meso level focusing on school institutions, and macro level looks at societal patterns like racism and stratification as a whole. CSP challenges deficit-based perspectives, which are beliefs that students' home cultures are problems. These beliefs function as social facts for them, ideas treated as truths even when they stereotype communities. By combining quantitative data, like numerical evidences like test scores, and qualitative data, like students' experiences, observations, interviews, and etc., my research displayed that CSP strengthens Latinx students' identity, cultural pride, and their overall sense of belonging. My topic examines CSP within the context of U.S. education. This matters because Latinx students are not a minority on the margins anymore. They are shaping what the next generation of the country will look like. But their educational outcomes still reflect wider patterns of stratification, meaning unequal layers of access based on power, prestige, and wealth. For decades, schools have framed bilingualism and multicultural practices as obstacles. CSP actually flips that narrative and recognizes them as forms of cultural capital, which refers to skills, language, and knowledge that help students succeed. Understanding these skills shifts its essentials for supporting Latinx academic success. My thesis is that CSP fundamentally transformed Latin education by validating cultural identity through symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism is a theory explaining how people create meaning through interactions. When students see themselves reflected positively in a curriculum, their identity really strengthens. Secondly, I like to challenge conflict theory dynamics in schooling. Conflict theory shows that institutions often reproduce inequality because dominant groups shape them in their own interests. Then, promoting social mobility through cultural capital is truly key, as bilingualism becomes an asset, not a barrier. And finally, resisting the institutional discrimination and racializations as CSP pushes against the idea that students must assimilate or suppress their identity to succeed. My project centers on three guiding research questions. How did CSP affect belonging and engagement for Latinx students? How do institutional barriers limit CSP implementation? And how do duolingual immersion programs influence academic achievement and cultural identity? These questions allow me to move from identity level experiences to structural challenges to real-world solutions. For my analysis, I'd like to focus on student identity and belonging. CSP reshapes how students see themselves. Traditional schooling often harms what Charles Cooley calls the looking glass self, meaning students' identity is shaped by how they feel others judge them. If schools devalue their language, students really internalize that shame. This creates a status inconsistency, where what makes them strong at home becomes viewed as a weakness in school. CSP challenges the symbolic interactionism of classrooms by creating a more affirming interactions. When a curriculum and instruction embraces students' languages and culture, students no longer have to split themselves between home and school identities. They develop a more integrated sense of self. This increases belonging, engagement, and motivation, directly countering the culture of prejudice that typically shapes the school expectations. Then I'd like to analyze institutional barriers. At the structural level, CSP faces major obstacles. Systemic institutional racism shapes the funding and resources available to Latinx majority schools. Institutional racism refers to the inequality created by policies and systems, not just individual prejudice. Schools serving Latinx communities are often underfunded, and this lack of financial capital makes it difficult to implement CSP, which requires training, curriculum redesign, and resources. Another barrier is test-based accountability. Schools are pressured to focus on standardized tests that reflect the cultural values of the dominant group. These tests become biased social facts, shaping how success is really defined. From a conflict theory perspective, the system is designed to reproduce stratification, keeping marginalized groups in lower positions. Teacher training programs rarely address the actual diversity within Latinx communities. As a result, even well-meaning educators lack the tools to apply CSP. Then, I'd like to analyze dual language immersion in classrooms. Dual language immersion is one of the clearest examples of CSP in action. Quantitative data shows that Latinx students in DLI programs perform as well or even better on standardized tests in comparison to peers in English-only programs. Meanwhile, qualitative field research reveals deeper impacts. Students in DLI develop stronger cultural identity, bilingual pride, and confidence. DLI programs treat the home language as a valuable cultural capital rather than a barrier. They represent a structural application of CSP because the entire system, curriculum, instruction, and environment is built around cultural affirmation rather than assimilation. This depicts that rigorous academic and cultural sustainability are not contradictory, but instead are complementary as they intertwine to work together to strengthen a student's cultural capital. Ultimately, CSP forces us to confront a national question. Will education continue to assimilate Latinx students into narrow definitions of success, or will it affirm their cultural strengths as part of what makes the country stronger? CSP shifts schools from assimilation to affirmation. It recognizes the Latinx identity as a resource, not an obstacle. Implementing CSP is not just a classroom choice, it's a structural societal imperative. It builds a future where Latinx students' success is not an exception, but an expectation. Thank you. I want to take a moment to highlight two key scholarly sources that shaped my project and how they informed my argument. First, I'd like to focus on Flores and Barrios in their 2019 article, Culturally Sustaining and Relevant Education for Latinx Students, published by the University of Pennsylvania. This article was a central aspect into understanding the institutional barriers faced by Latinx majority schools. Flores and Barrientos argue that chronic underfunding, standardized testing pressures, and teachers' preparation programs all contributed to environments that work against culturally grounded teaching practices. Their work helped me frame institutional racism as an ongoing structural problem rather than isolated incidents. They understood how financial capital influences whether CSP can actually be implemented in schools. And finally, they show that the lack of cultural responsiveness in teachers' training is not accidental, but a product of how educational institutions reproduce inequality. Overall, their research provided the macro-level context that explains why CSP remains difficult to adopt, even though it's highly effective. Then I'd like to take a moment to focus on Paris and Alim's 2017 article, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies, Teaching and Learning for Justice in a Changing World. This was published by the Teachers College Press. Paris and Alim are the scholars who formally developed the framework for culturally sustaining pedagogy. Their work argues that education should not only recognize cultural diversity, but actively nurture it and sustain it. They critique older models like culturally responsive teaching, saying that even those approaches can unintentionally aim to fit students into dominant norms. CSP goes further than that. It centers students' lived experiences and linguistic practices as legitimate, powerful, and academically valuable. This source shaped the core of my presentation as it defined CSP theoretically. It also grounded my discussion of symbolic interactionism and identity. Furthermore, it connected student belonging to larger goals of cultural affirmation, and they also offered examples of pedagogical practices that align with CSP values. Paris and Alim's work served as the foundation for my thesis, showing that academic success and cultural preservation are not mutually exclusive. Using these two sources side by side allowed my project to examine us both from the theoretical perspective and the structural institutional perspective. Together, they helped me show that although CSP is a deeply effective model for Latinx students, the reason it isn't widespread has nothing to do with the students themselves. The barriers come from the structures, funding, testing, training, and policy, not from Latinx communities themselves. These sources both reinforce the central message of my project, that CSP is not just an instructional preference, it's a necessary framework for creating equitable outcomes for Latinx students, and it reveals how deeply educational institutions must change for that equity to become a reality. Thank you for watching my presentation for Sociology 3AC. Hope you have a good day. Thank you.